The last night always starts the same way in Montana. Not with a scream, not with a gunshot, not with some cinematic omen in the sky. It starts with the quiet work of a place that never truly sleeps. A windmill ticking in the distance like a patient clock. A calf bawling once, then settling. A porch light burning over a mud-caked pair of boots that someone forgot to bring inside. And a long stretch of road where headlights can be seen for minutes before they arrive, if they arrive at all. On that ranch in 1979, the air had a bite to it. Not full winter, but the kind of cold that comes early and stays late, slipping through denim and wool as if your layers are a suggestion, not protection. The bunkhouse smelled like damp coats, coffee gone stale on a hot plate, and the faint, sour edge of sweat that never fully leaves a room where men come in from the same hard work day after day. Inside, a handful of ranch hands did what ranch hands always do at the end of a shift. They argued softly about nothing. They teased each other with tired smiles. They kept half an ear tuned to the sounds outside, the barn doors settling, the horses shifting, the coyotes testing the dark. Because out here, listening is a habit, and habits are what keep you alive. The radio on the shelf crackled with static, and then caught a late-night song, tinny and far away. A man at the table, call him Wade, rolled a cigarette with slow fingers, watching the paper like it was a small, precise job that deserved respect. Another man, Miles, sat on his bunk, boots still on, staring at a blister on his palm as if he didn't quite believe it belonged to him. He was new, fresh enough that the ranch still felt like a challenge instead of a life sentence. Near the stove, an older hand named Lyle kept shifting his weight, like his bones didn't settle right anymore. Lyle had been on enough ranches to know that every place had a personality, every boss had a rhythm, every crew had a balance. And when balance changes, you feel it first in the small things. A laugh that doesn't finish. A door that closes too carefully. A name that doesn't get said. That night, the laughter didn't finish. The door closed too carefully. And the name nobody said was the name of the man who was supposed to be in charge of them. The foreman. A man who ran the ranch like it was a ship, and he was the only one who knew the water. A man the hands respected in public and feared in private. A man who, for reasons that would only become clear later, had decided that trust was a liability. And the worst part? The men in that bunkhouse didn't know they were on the last night you should have trusted anyone. Not the foreman, not the new guy, not even the quiet hand who always offered to make coffee. Because in a remote place, where help is a rumor, and the nearest neighbor is a long drive through black prairie, trust isn't just a feeling. It's a tool. And on that ranch in 1979, someone picked up that tool and used it like a blade. The ranch that kept its own secrets Montana ranches can look like postcards from a distance. Wide sky, clean horizon. A sense of freedom so big it almost feels like you could walk into it and disappear. But a working ranch isn't a postcard. It's a machine. It runs on schedules, fences, feed, weather, and the kind of labor that doesn't leave room for softness. It runs on people who can stand in the wind all day and still show up at dusk to fix what broke. And it runs, quietly, on a hierarchy. At the top, the owner. Sometimes present, sometimes not. Sometimes more myth than man. Below that, the foreman. The true authority. The one who tells you where to be, what to do, and how quickly to do it. Then the hands. Men who come from everywhere. Some running from trouble, some chasing a paycheck, some just built for open land and hard work. They sleep in bunks, they eat fast, they talk tough, they keep their pride hidden like cash, because pride out here can get you hurt. In 1979, the ranch at the center of this story sat far enough from the nearest town that the town lights were a memory. It had the usual structures: Barn, corrals, sheds, a main house that stayed warmer than everything else, and the bunkhouse where the hands lived with each other's habits. And like most isolated operations, it had its own rules. Don't wander at night. Don't go into the owner's barn without permission. Don't ask questions about money. Don't talk about what you see on the back acreage. And the biggest rule of all, spoken and unspoken. If you want to keep your job, you keep your mouth shut. Most hands could live with that. Silence is easier when you're tired. But that year, something made silence heavier. Something made the air feel watched. It started small. A hand named Curtis got paid late, just one envelope missing when everyone else got theirs. The foreman brushed it off, said it was a bookkeeping hiccup, told Curtis he'd make it right. A week later, Curtis's envelope arrived, but the amount felt off. Not dramatically. Just enough to make a man count twice. Curtis asked about it. Not loudly, not disrespectfully. Just a question. The foreman looked at him for a moment too long and said, "You calling me a thief?" Curtis swallowed and said, "No, sir." The foreman nodded like that settled it. But the next day, Curtis got assigned to a brutal stretch of fence line alone, miles out, far from anyone, the kind of job you give a man when you want him to feel small. Another hand, Earl, noticed equipment going missing. A small generator, some tools. Items that didn't just walk away in the wind. Earl mentioned it, casually, at the table. The foreman smiled and said, "Then keep better track of your things." It sounded like advice, but it landed like blame. Then there were the other things. The owner's truck that kept showing up on the road at odd hours. A strange sedan seen once, parked behind a stand of cottonwoods, as if it wanted the ranch to think it wasn't there. A phone call the foreman took outside, voice low, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the yard like he expected someone to be listening. And the biggest change of all, the foreman began choosing who worked with who, not based on skill, based on something else. He separated the talkers. He paired the quiet men together. He kept the new guy close. And he started locking the main house office at night with a new padlock, shiny and heavy, like a symbol. If you asked why, he'd say, "Because I can." In places like this, "because I can" is often the first step toward "because you can't." The men who were there to understand why that last night turned deadly, you have to understand the people inside it, not as archetypes, as men with routines, fears, and private calculations. Wade was the steady one, mid-30s, strong without showing off, the kind of hand who could fix a broken gate with baling wire and stubbornness. Wade didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. That's a different kind of power than the foreman's. It's earned, not assigned. Miles was the newcomer, young, hungry, still carrying the soft edges of a life that hadn't fully hardened him yet. He was respectful, eager, maybe a little too trusting. He laughed too easily at the older men's jokes, like he wanted to belong fast. Lyle was older, late 50s, with hands that looked permanently stained by work. Lyle's eyes missed nothing. He was the kind of man who had survived enough to know that survival is often about noticing trouble before trouble announces itself. Curtis was proud. That pride was both his strength and his flaw. He carried an old injury in his knee and an old resentment in his voice. Curtis was the one most likely to say what everyone else was thinking, which made him useful and dangerous. Earl was practical, the kind of man who wanted everything accounted for. He didn't like mystery. He didn't like loose ends. On a ranch, that makes you good at the job. In a situation like this, it makes you a threat. And then there was the foreman. We'll call him Harlan. Harlan had the confidence of a man who believed the ranch belonged to him even if the deed didn't. He walked like the ground owed him something. He spoke slowly, like he expected every word to land. In public, Harlan was competent. He kept the ranch running. He dealt with supply deliveries. He handled the owner's occasional visits. He could charm a county inspector if he needed to. In private, at least in the moments the hands caught in side glances, Harlan carried something colder. A need to control. Not just the work. The men. The stories. The perception of who was loyal and who wasn't. And the reason that mattered was simple. Control is a habit that grows. If you let it, it becomes hunger. And hunger doesn't stop when it's full. It stops when it's confronted. Or when it wipes out whatever might confront it. The week before, when trust started leaking. By the time that final night arrived, trust in the bunkhouse had already started to leak out through small cracks. Curtis had been talking about leaving. Not because he wanted to, because he felt something tightening. He told Wade one evening, quiet. Something's off. Wade didn't answer right away. Wade wasn't the type to fuel paranoia. But he did something that said more than words. He looked out the bunkhouse window toward the yard lights, toward the main house, toward the dark beyond. And he nodded once. Lyle began sleeping lighter. It's a strange thing. Sleep becomes different when your instincts start warning you. You start waking up for no reason, then realizing there is a reason. The wind changed, a door moved. A truck rolled slowly. Earl started writing things down. Not a diary, not emotions. Times. Which truck was where, which tools were missing, how many gallons of fuel went out. It wasn't evidence for court. It was evidence for sanity. Proof that he wasn't imagining it. Miles, the new guy, didn't notice any of this. Or if he did, he interpreted it through optimism. He thought the older men were just grumpy. He thought the foreman's intensity was normal. He thought isolation made everyone weird. And Harlan. Harlan watched all of them the way a man watches cattle when a storm is coming. Not with sympathy, with assessment. Who will spook the herd? Who will bolt? Who will lead others? Who will make noise? Harlan began favoring Miles, giving him easier tasks, calling him kid, with a smile that felt paternal. To Miles, it felt like opportunity. To the older men, it felt like positioning. Then came the rumor that snapped everything into focus. Someone in town, at a feed store maybe, or a bar where ranch hands drifted on payday, mentioned that the ranch owner was having money trouble, that there were loans, that there were whispers about selling off acreage. In a different context, that would have been gossip. But on that ranch, it raised a new possibility. If the ranch was unstable, people might start taking what they could. If the ranch owner wasn't paying attention, Harlan might be running things more independently than anyone realized. And if Harlan had been skimming, stealing, or doing something worse, then men like Earl, with his notes, and Curtis, with his pride, became liabilities. Liabilities make some people nervous. And nervous people make choices, especially when they believe they can choose in the dark. The last day. Ordinary work. Unordinary air. The last day began like any other. Coffee that tasted burned but necessary. A sky so wide it looked indifferent. The sound of gates clanging, horses snorting, a chain dragging over hard ground. The men did their jobs. They fixed what broke. They fed what needed feeding. They argued about small things, and then forgot the arguments because work doesn't care. But under the ordinary rhythms, something else was moving. Harlan called Wade aside near the barn and said he needed him to check a fence line at dusk. Wade frowned. That fence line was normally a morning task. Harlan said, "Do it at dusk. I want to see it myself." Wade didn't like it, but he nodded. Harlan assigned Curtis to work alone on the back acreage. Again. Curtis muttered something under his breath. Harlan smiled as if he didn't hear it. Harlan told Earl to inventory the tool shed and bring the list to the office. Earl looked surprised. Harlan had never cared about lists before. But Earl did it. He liked lists. Harlan told Miles to stick close to the main house after supper because the owner might call. Miles nodded, eager to be useful. Lyle watched all of this without speaking. Then, when nobody was looking, Lyle slipped Earl a glance that said, "Pay attention." Earl gave a tiny nod. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. It carried a thin dust that made the horizon look smeared. The sun dropped low and turned the yard lights into a kind of staged glow. The men drifted back toward the bunkhouse as night came on. Supper was simple: beans, bread, meat that tasted like it had been cooked with more efficiency than care. Conversation was thin. Curtis ate fast and left early. Earl sat with his list in his pocket like it was heavier than paper. Miles cracked jokes nobody laughed at. Wade stared at the steam rising from his coffee and seemed to be measuring something in his mind. Lyle kept his back to the wall, eyes on the door. And when Harlan finally walked into the bunkhouse doorway, he didn't enter. He stood there, framed by the cold yard light behind him, as if he wanted to look like authority made visible. He said, "Wade, you and Curtis, come with me." Curtis looked up, surprised. "Why me?" Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Because I said so." Wade stood slowly, like a man trying not to startle an animal. Curtis hesitated. Then he stood too. Because in places like this, refusing the foreman is a risky kind of pride. They stepped outside. The bunkhouse door closed behind them with a soft thud, and inside Earl felt his stomach drop because he realized the foreman had just removed the two men most likely to resist. Miles watched, confused, then looked at Lyle as if seeking an explanation. Lyle didn't give one. He just stood up, slow, and said, "Stay put." Miles blinked. "What?" Lyle repeated it, quieter. "Stay put." And when Lyle moved toward the window to watch the yard, Miles felt the first real chill of the night that had nothing to do with weather, because there are different kinds of cold. One comes from wind. The other comes from realizing that the men around you are afraid, and they have a reason. Outside. Where trust dies quietly. The yard was lit in patches, pools of yellow near buildings, long black stretches between them. Wade and Curtis followed Harlan toward the barn. Harlan walked ahead, confident, not looking back. Curtis lagged half a step behind, muttering, "This is bull. Fence can wait." Wade didn't answer. Wade's eyes kept moving. Left, right, roofline, shadows. Harlan reached the barn doors and stopped. He didn't open them. He turned to face them. The yard light caught his face in a way that made his expression hard to read. He said, "We got a problem." Curtis snorted. "You're the problem." That was the pride talking. That was the mistake. Harlan's jaw tightened. "You got a mouth on you," he said. Curtis stepped forward, anger warming him. "I got a paycheck that don't match." Harlan's eyes flicked to Wade. "You hear this?" Wade's voice was low. "Everybody hears it." That was Wade's mistake, honesty. In Harlan's world, honesty wasn't loyalty. Honesty was threat. Harlan took a breath that looked almost like patience. "You boys been thinking," he said. "You been writing. You been talking." Curtis laughed once. "So what, that's illegal now?" Harlan's gaze stayed calm. "Out here," he said, "there's what's legal, and there's what gets you buried in paperwork." The phrase buried landed wrong. Wade felt it. Curtis felt it too, though his pride refused to process it. Curtis said, "What are you going to do, Harlan? Fire us?" Harlan's smile was thin. Something like that. And then the barn door creaked, not opened by Harlan, opened from inside. A figure stepped out, Someone Wade recognized as another hand who had been quiet all week, a man who'd avoided conversations, who'd kept his eyes down. He wasn't supposed to be in the barn. Curtis turned sharply. "What the hell?" Harlan didn't move fast. He didn't need to. The yard, the lighting, the positioning, everything had already been arranged. This was never a conversation. It was a setup. And in that moment, Wade understood the title of their last night. No one should have trusted. Not the foreman. Not the quiet hand. Not the familiarity of routine. Because routine was the trap. Wade's body tensed, calculating distance to the bunkhouse, distance to the truck, distance to the darkness. Curtis's body tensed too, but his tension came from rage, not strategy. He stepped toward Harlan. Harlan raised a hand. Not a fist, not a weapon, just a hand, and said almost softly, "Don't." Curtis didn't stop. Wade moved, trying to grab Curtis's sleeve, but Curtis shook him off, and then everything broke, not in a clear cinematic line. In confusion, shadows, bodies turning the wrong way, boots scraping hard ground, a shove, a stumble, a sound. Sharp, sudden. That wasn't a scream and wasn't a gunshot, but a heavy impact, like a body hitting wood. Wade's heart hammered. Curtis made a sound that cut off too quickly. Wade lunged forward, but a figure from the barn blocked him, arms out, forceful. Wade swung, desperate. He connected. The figure staggered. Wade ran. He didn't run towards the bunkhouse. He ran into darkness. Because he understood the yard was now controlled territory. And controlled territory is where you die. As Wade disappeared into the black between buildings, the yard light behind him caught Harlan's face for a second. Not angry, not panicked, focused, like a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed privately. Wade ran until his lungs burned. He hit the edge of the pasture and kept going. Behind him, the ranch stayed lit in patches like a stage. Ahead of him, the land opened into a dark, endless plain. And he realized another truth. Distance can save you, but only if someone doesn't know where you're going. On that ranch, Harlan knew the land. Harlan knew the fences. Harlan knew the routes. Wade had lived there long enough to know the same. But knowledge doesn't guarantee safety. It just gives you choices. And on that last night, choices were narrowing fast. Inside the bunkhouse, the decision point. Back in the bunkhouse, Earl and Lyle heard the commotion. Not clearly, just enough. A thud, a brief scramble of footsteps, a door creak, then a silence that felt too big. Miles stood up, confused. "What's going on?" Earl looked at Lyle, eyes wide. "That's not normal." Lyle didn't answer. He moved to the bunkhouse door and pressed his ear against it like a man listening for a storm. For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly, something like a dragged step. Lyle turned. His voice was low, controlled. "We leave. Now." Miles shook his head. "Leave? Where?" Earl swallowed. "Town," he said. "We go to town." Miles's face tightened. "Harlan said stay close to the main house." Lyle looked at him with a kind of sadness. "That's why we leave." Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out his inventory list. The paper that had felt like nothing earlier and now felt like evidence of a trap. He held it like a shield. Miles looked between them, trying to reconcile the world he believed in, a foreman who was strict but fair, with the fear in these men's eyes. He said, "You're overreacting." Lyle stepped closer and grabbed Miles's jacket collar gently but firmly, like an uncle who knows better. "Kid," he said, "you don't know what you're standing in." Miles's mouth opened, ready to argue. Then the bunkhouse door handle moved. Slow. Testing. Like someone wanted to know if it was locked. Earl's breath stopped. Lyle's eyes sharpened. Miles froze. The handle stopped. Then a knock. Not aggressive. Polite. And Harlan's voice came through, calm as ever. "Open up. I need you boys." That calm voice was the worst part, because it made it sound like everything was normal, like this was just ranch business, like no one was in danger. Lyle's jaw tightened. He whispered, "Don't." Miles, still trapped by habit, took a step towards the door. Earl reached out and grabbed his arm. "No." Miles yanked his arm back. "He's the foreman," Lyle said, barely audible. "Foreman ain't God." Harlan knocked again, still calm. "Open the door." Miles stared at the door like it held the answer. Then he did what young men do when they've never faced the real consequences of trusting the wrong person. He moved toward the door anyway. Earl's hands shook. He didn't have a weapon. He had paper. Lyle stepped between Miles and the door. Harlan's voice lowered. "Lyle," he said, as if they were friends. "Don't make this harder." Lyle's eyes closed for half a beat, like a man deciding whether he wants to die in a bunkhouse or die in the open. He opened them and said, loud enough for the door to hear, "We're not opening." Silence. Then Harlan's calm voice came back, slightly colder. "All right." Footsteps moved away from the door. Not hurried, measured. Earl felt his stomach twist. "What's he doing?" Lyle didn't answer. He grabbed a coat, shoved it into Earl's arms, then shoved another into Miles's. "Back window," he said. Miles blinked. "We can't," Lyle snapped. "Now." They moved like men escaping a fire they couldn't yet see. Lyle pushed the back window up with a soft squeal. Cold air poured in. Earl climbed out first, boots hitting frozen ground with a dull thud. Miles followed, awkward. Heart pounding. Lyle climbed out last, careful, eyes scanning the yard. As soon as they hit the dark behind the bunkhouse, they heard it, the front door opening, Harlan stepping inside, and his calm voice speaking to an empty room. "Boys?" Lyle grabbed Earl's sleeve and pulled him toward the fence line. Miles stumbled after them, breath ragged, mind still trying to catch up. Behind them, the bunkhouse light stayed on. A warm square in the dark. A place that should have been safe. A place that was now a trap someone else controlled. And out on the yard, a flashlight beam cut across the ground, slow and searching. Harlan wasn't shouting. He wasn't panicking. He was hunting, the kind of hunting that doesn't waste bullets, the kind that uses patience and the land itself. Because in Montana, the land can hide you. But it can also expose you. It depends on who knows it better. Wade in the dark. The long run. Wade ran until the ranch lights were behind him, and the world became only wind and grass and black sky. He knew if he ran straight, he'd hit a fence line. If he ran wrong, he'd run into a gully and break an ankle. If he ran too fast, he'd burn out and collapse. So he forced himself to move smart. He angled toward a low ridge he knew from cattle runs, a place where the ground dipped and the wind cut less aggressively. He listened. He heard, faintly, an engine. A truck starting. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Not a chase yet. A reposition. That was worse, because it meant Harlan wasn't improvising. He was executing. Wade found the ridge and dropped low, breathing through his nose to keep the sound small. From the ridge, he could see the ranch yard lights in the distance, those pools of yellow. He watched a flashlight beam move near the bunkhouse. He watched the truck lights sweep as the truck turned. He watched the ranch become a chessboard. And he realized something that made his chest tighten. This wasn't just about stealing or paychecks. This wasn't just about a foreman covering his tracks. This was about a man who believed he could erase problems the way you erase hoofprints by dragging a branch over the dirt. Wade's mind raced. Curtis was probably down. Maybe dead. Earl and Lyle and Miles, if they hadn't gotten out, would be next. Wade had to do one thing, One simple thing, if he wanted anyone to survive. Get to town. Get to a phone. Get to a place where the ranch's private rules didn't apply. The problem was distance. The ranch sat far enough that town meant a long run or a long drive. Wade didn't have a vehicle. He had legs and darkness. He moved again, staying low, using the land's folds. The wind hammered his face. His lungs burned. But he kept moving because fear, real fear, doesn't always make you freeze. Sometimes it makes you become very, very practical. And the practical truth was this. If he didn't reach the outside world before Harlan could reset the ranch into silence, everyone left on that property would become a story nobody could prove, a tragedy without evidence, an incident that got labeled accident or missing or unknown. Wade had seen enough of the world to know that unknown is where killers hide. So he ran. And behind him, the ranch kept its lights burning, like a ship that had already decided it didn't care who drowned in its wake. The three behind the bunkhouse, trust's last test. Lyle led Earl and Miles through the dark along the fence line, away from the yard lights. He chose routes that kept them in shadow. He avoided open ground. He moved like a man who'd survived enough to know that speed isn't as important as invisibility. Miles kept glancing back, breathing hard. "This is insane," he whispered. "We're gonna get fired." Earl hissed. "You think this is about being fired?" Miles didn't answer because part of him was starting to understand, and understanding felt like a betrayal of the world he'd assumed was stable. They reached a stand of trees near a shallow drainage ditch. Lyle crouched, pulling them down with him. They waited. The wind moved branches overhead. A far-off dog barked once, then the flashlight beam appeared again, closer now, sweeping across the ground, slow and methodical. Miles's mouth went dry. Earl's hands clenched his paper list until it crumpled. Lyle stayed calm, eyes tracking the beam. They heard footsteps, boots on hard ground. Not running, walking, Harlan's walk. They heard his voice, soft, speaking to someone else. A second voice answered, nervous, obedient. That meant Harlan wasn't alone. That meant Harlan had at least one man on his side. The beam swept closer. It hit the edge of the ditch, paused, then moved on. Miles felt a surge of relief too early. Because relief is the moment you make noise. Lyle grabbed Miles's shoulder, holding him still. The beam swung back, as if it had sensed movement. It hovered, then moved away again. Footsteps passed. Harlan's voice drifted, calm, almost conversational. "They'll get tired," he said. "They always do." Miles swallowed hard, realizing he was being spoken about like an animal. Earl's eyes filled with a quiet, furious fear. When the footsteps faded, Lyle leaned close and whispered, "We keep moving. We don't stop." Miles nodded, finally fully convinced. They moved again, deeper along the property edge, toward the road that led to town. But as they approached the road, a new sound rose. An engine. Closer. A truck approaching without headlights, the way a man drives when he doesn't want the road to know he's there. Lyle froze. Earl froze. Miles froze. The truck rolled by on the ranch road, slow, searching, then stopped. And in the cold dark, the brake lights glowed red, two eyes in the night. Lyle whispered, "Down." They dropped into the ditch. Mud soaked their pants. Miles bit his lip to keep from making a sound. The truck door opened. A man stepped out. Not Harlan this time. Another hand. One of the quiet ones. The man stood on the road and listened. Then he called out, not loudly, but with confidence. "Come on out," he said. "We ain't gonna hurt you." Earl's heart slammed. Miles's throat tightened. Lyle stared up at the road, expression flat. Because that sentence, "We ain't gonna hurt you," was the oldest lie. The lie that exists to make you reveal yourself. The man on the road continued, voice almost friendly. "Foreman just wants to talk, that's all." Miles shifted, like he might believe it. Lyle grabbed him, hard. "No." Miles mouthed. "He sounds—" Lyle's eyes cut him. "No." The man waited. Then, when nobody came out, his voice changed slightly. Not angry, impatient. "All right," he said. "Suit yourself." He got back into the truck. The engine started again, and the truck rolled forward. But it didn't leave. It moved to a position that blocked the road. A blockade. A quiet declaration. You're not getting past. Earl felt sick. Lyle's mind moved quickly. "We go around," he whispered. "We cut through the north pasture and hit the county road." Earl whispered back, "That's Miles." Lyle's voice was steel. "Better Miles than dead." Miles didn't argue now, because the night had finally taught him what no ranch job application ever warns you about. A foreman can become your enemy, and if he does, the ranch becomes a cage with no walls. They turned away from the blocked road and started moving through the pasture, stepping carefully to avoid frozen ruts, bodies hunched against wind. Behind them, the truck stayed idling like a patient predator, waiting for them to make a mistake, waiting for fatigue, waiting for the moment trust cracked into desperation. Because desperation makes you visible, and visibility, out here, can be fatal. The long break. Dawn's thin promise. Dawn in Montana can feel like mercy, not because it's warm, because it's light. Light means you can see what's trying to kill you, but dawn is also cruel, because light means you can be seen. As the sky began to pale, Wade reached the edge of the county road, exhausted, hands numb, breath burning. He looked back once, saw the ranch lights far behind, and felt a surge of anger so sharp it almost gave him strength. He started jogging down the road toward town. In the distance, he saw a car's headlights. Real headlights, normal headlights, the kind that meant ordinary life still existed. He waved both arms. The car slowed. A woman behind the wheel rolled her window down a crack, face tense. "You okay?" Wade's voice cracked. "Call the sheriff," he said. "Now." The woman stared at him, confused, alarmed, then saw his face, mud, sweat, fear, and her expression changed. She didn't ask more. She drove. Wade kept moving. Behind him, far off, a truck appeared on the county road, rolling fast now, headlights on, no longer hiding, because the night was ending. And Harlan needed to finish whatever he started before the world woke up. Wade ran harder. His lungs screamed. He heard the truck gaining. He stumbled, caught himself, kept going. Then, blessed sound. A siren. Not close yet. But coming. Wade's chest tightened with relief that tasted like metal. The truck behind him slowed. Harlan's plan had depended on isolation. A world where no one arrived. A world where everything could be explained away. But a siren meant the outside world had entered the story. And once the outside world enters, you can't control everything with a calm voice anymore. Wade reached the edge of town just as the first patrol car turned onto the county road. He collapsed against a fence, shaking, and pointed back toward the ranch. "Please," he rasped, "there—" He couldn't finish the sentence, because finishing meant making it real. The deputy looked at him, eyes narrowing, then glanced toward the ranch road. "Who's they?" the deputy asked. Wade swallowed hard, and said the name that, on that ranch, had meant authority. "Harlan." The deputy's jaw tightened. He'd heard the foreman's name before, in other contexts. Complaints, rumors, small-town conversations that never became official. He nodded once. Then he got back in the car and drove. Wade stayed where he was, shaking, as the siren moved away. Behind the deputy, another car arrived. An older man with a rancher's face stepping out, asking questions, trying to help. Wade didn't answer everything. He just watched the road, because while help was finally coming, the ranch was still out there, holding its secrets. And secrets don't loosen easily. The ranch after sunrise. What they found, what they didn't. When deputies reached the ranch, the yard looked ordinary in daylight. That's the eerie thing about places where something terrible happened at night. Morning doesn't care. Morning shines on everything with the same indifferent light. The bunkhouse door was open. Inside, blankets were tossed, coffee cups half full, a chair knocked slightly out of place. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like men had left in a hurry. The barn was locked. A new padlock on the main doors, shiny in the sun. The foreman's truck sat near the main house, parked neatly. No panic in its positioning. But deputies didn't trust neatness. Neatness can be staging. They searched. They called out names. No answer. They found Curtis's hat near the barn. Stepped on. Dirty. They found a scuffed boot print where the ground had been disturbed. They found, farther out, a smear of churned mud near the yard light. But they didn't find what they wanted most. Clear answers. Because Harlan had used the night the way predators use darkness, to blur edges, to erase clean narratives. Wade's testimony, what he could give through shaking, provided a direction. But on the ranch itself, daylight gave them only fragments. A piece of cloth snagged on a fence, a tool out of place, a door that had been opened and then carefully closed. And the strangest detail of all, Harlan was nowhere to be found. Neither were Lyle, Earl, or Miles. Wade had escaped. But the others? The ranch had swallowed them. The deputies widened the search. They checked the north pasture. They checked drainage ditches. They checked the county road. They found tracks, tire tracks, boot tracks, but everything was muddled by morning frost and the restless wind. By midday, word spread. A ranch incident, men missing, a foreman gone. Small-town talk turned the story into something half myth, half warning before the facts could settle. And the owner, finally contacted, arrived on the property with a face that looked like someone had punched his life. He walked through the yard, staring at his own buildings like they were strangers. He asked the deputies, "What happened?" And the deputy, tired, skeptical, careful with words, said, "Something bad." That's what morning gave them. Not closure, just the beginning of an investigation. And investigations in rural places come with their own limits, distance, weather, time, and the simple reality that land can keep what it takes. What Wade told them later. In the days that followed, Wade's story became the spine. He didn't claim to know everything. He didn't pretend he saw every moment clearly. He said what he knew. Harlan called Wade and Curtis out. Harlan confronted them. Someone else was there. Curtis went down. Wade ran. Inside the bunkhouse, Harlan knocked, calm, trying to draw the others out. Lyle refused. They fled. That's what Wade believed happened. And in his belief, there was a detail that mattered. Harlan wasn't alone. Harlan had at least one helper. Maybe more. That meant this wasn't a sudden outburst. It was planned. Planned enough to recruit. Planned enough to block roads. Planned enough to use the ranch itself as a controlled environment. The deputy asked Wade the question that always arrives in stories like this. Why? Wade stared at the table in the sheriff's office, the cheap wood scratched by decades of paperwork and tired hands. He said, "Money." Then he shook his head slightly. Like he didn't want it to be that simple. He said, "And pride." Because in Wade's mind, the conflict wasn't only about missing equipment or late pay. It was about the kind of man Harlan was. a man who couldn't tolerate being questioned, a man who interpreted curiosity as accusation, a man who believed control was the same as safety. And a man like that, when cornered, doesn't apologize. He escalates. Wade's voice got quieter. He didn't want anybody talking, he said. The deputy leaned back, exhaled slowly, and nodded, because that motive, silencing, was sadly familiar. It wasn't a Montana-specific evil. It was a human one. The evil that grows when someone thinks the easiest way to solve a problem is to remove the people who can speak about it. Not argue with them, not negotiate. Remove. And in isolated places, removal can look like an accident, a missing man, a wandering off, a bad storm, a wrong turn. That's why this story lingers, because it lives on the edge between tragedy and erasure, between what happened and what can be proven, where the others went. The missing men, Lyle, Earl, Miles, became the heartache, because one survivor can tell a story, but 3 missing men create a void. Search parties formed, neighbors joined, men on horseback rode through gullies and scrub. People drove back roads slowly, scanning for anything that didn't belong. They found traces. An empty coat snagged on barbed wire, torn by wind. A crushed cigarette pack. A piece of paper, Earl's inventory list, mud-stained and crumpled near a ditch, the ink blurred. That list hit people harder than it should have, because it was such an ordinary thing. A record of tools, a man doing his job, and it ended up in mud like a goodbye. But as days turned into weeks, the land kept its answers. Some said the men were dead. Some said they fled. Some insisted Harlan took them somewhere. Some even suggested the men were complicit, which is what communities sometimes do when they can't handle the idea that innocence can be swallowed without reason. The sheriff's office chased leads. Harlan's past was examined. Former ranch jobs, old incidents, rumors that had never become charges. Some stories painted him as a hard man. Some painted him as charming. Some painted him as unpredictable. None painted him as the kind of man you should trust in the dark. But evidence was thin, and thin evidence makes thick doubt. The one thing that remained consistent was the feeling that the last night was engineered, that somebody controlled it, that the ranch, for a few hours, became a closed world where the rules were written by whoever held the most power and the least conscience. And in that world, trust was the weapon used against them. The meaning of no one should have trusted people. Hear this story and fixate on the violence, on the moment things snapped, on the thud by the barn, on the chase, on the missing men. But the most haunting part isn't the physical danger, it's the betrayal. Because ranch hands trust each other in a way city people often don't understand. Not sentimental trust. Functional trust. Trust that the man next to you will close the gate, will not leave you alone with a half-broken horse, will not abandon you when weather turns, will not lie about where the truck is, will not lure you out into darkness under the excuse of work. That last night shattered that kind of trust. It turned routine into a trap. It turned authority into a threat. It turned the quiet friendliness of a ranch crew into something that could hide a plan. And that's why the story carries its warning in the title. Not the Montana ranch killings, not the foreman's crime, not the night everything went wrong. The last night no one should have trusted, because trust that night was the thing that got men to step outside. Trust got Curtis close enough to argue. Trust got Wade close enough to follow. Trust nearly got Miles to open the door. Trust is what Harlan used as bait. And once you understand that, the story becomes bigger than one ranch. It becomes a reminder of how danger often arrives, not through strangers, through familiar voices, through ordinary requests, through the comfort of, it's probably fine, until it isn't. Closing reflection. Out on the prairie, There's a moment just before full daylight where the world looks washed clean. The sky turns pale, frost shines on fence posts. The wind still cuts, but you can see where it's coming from. That morning in 1979, daylight came like it always does. It didn't bring back the men who vanished into night. It didn't fix what broke. It didn't make Harlan appear with his hands up and a confession ready. It simply exposed a ranch that looked normal and felt wrong. And for the people who lived near it, who drove past it, who hired hands and trusted foremen, and believed routine meant safety. That was the real disturbance. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere isolated enough for the night to take control. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Not a dramatic one, a practical one. If you're far from help, far from neighbors, far from cell service, far from anyone who can hear you, what do you trust? Authority? Routine? The calm voice at the door? Or your own instincts, even when they make you seem paranoid? And if you've ever had that moment, when something feels off, but the world around you keeps acting normal, what did you do? Did you stay? Did you speak? Or did you get out before the last night became your last night?